So welcome to everyone who's joining the first ever Jewish Forum for Dialogue Forum. It's really, really exciting just to introduce who we are, what we do, and who you are speaking with today. I'm Shirley Fruchter. I'm a junior at Yeshiva University, and I'm a fellow for the Ronald S. Lauder Fellowship with the World Jewish Congress. And in partnership with Deborah Cooper-Smith, who has been an excellent partner and co-founder of the Jewish Forum for Dialogue, we're so excited to really kick this off. And before we begin, just special thanks, of course, to Deborah, to the World Jewish Congress, specifically Yoni Hammerman, and from YU Center for Israel Studies, Professor Stephen Fine, from the YU's Schneier Program for International Affairs, Professor Ronnie Perellis, and of course to Hashem for making this all possible and really making this all come to fruition. So what is the Jewish Forum for Dialogue? The Jewish Forum for Dialogue is an apolitical, bipartisan, nonprofit, student-led think tank. I know it's a lot of adjectives. Really gathering Jewish students to come to the table and have the important conversations on the issues facing world Jewry today. So every seminar is focused on a different issue, and this particular seminar is centered around the question, what is Zionism for us today? And thinking about the real value of the dialogue and the idea behind why the Jewish Forum for Dialogue is so important, there's a line in a Gemara in Tractate Brachot where it says that Torah scholars create more peace in the world. So Rabbi Avraham Isaac HaKohen Cook shares a really excellent idea on this, explaining that the idea is truth is built like a house. And the more people we have in a conversation, the more perspectives we have, the more people who are sharing their own understanding of an issue, the greater the truth we build. And in terms of the Jewish people, in terms of Am Yisrael, it allows us to walk together as a more unified and more direction-focused people, appreciating the diversity and the plurality of thought and experience within all of us. So we are very excited to welcome the 8 Jewish Forum for Dialogue participants, in no particular order, who I guess is on my screen: Zahava Fertig, Nava Katz, Joe Stern, Akiva Levy, Nina Siegel, Benji Gottesman, and Sammy Intrator. Thank you all so much for joining us today. It's been really, really exciting for the past few weeks learning about Zionism with you. And without further ado, I'm going to pass it off to Deborah to kick off the conversation.
So when Sruli and I were figuring out which questions would be great opening ones, we thought that the first question should be the question that brought us all together. So whoever wants to start it off, feel free. But the question is, what does Zionism mean to you today?
Just to call out, because I guess who wants to be the first? Zahav, you're on my screen first if you want to start off with the question.
Absolutely. Thank you, Shirley and Deborah. What does Zionism mean to me? Zionism means to me that there is a place in the Middle East called Israel, and that whenever I'm ready and when I'm ready, that place is there waiting for me to come. It means that I have my passport that was renewed. It means that I have my Aliyah application open. Whether or not I'm going to use it in the next few months or in the next few years, the fact that it's there, that it's available, that's what Zionism means to me.
But so are you saying that Zionism is dependent on you ending up in Israel? Like, is it possible to be a Zionist outside of Israel?
I can happily answer. That's very much a personal response of what Zionism is, response to Akiva, but it's not the definition of Zionism. It's very much a personal, this is my viewpoint. But I'm happy to hear what other people have to say about what Zionism is to them specifically, but also more generally.
So I guess my Zionism is a little bit different. I see Zionism rooted in the 37th chapter of the book of Jeremiah, where God shows the prophet a vision of dry bones, and those bones are a metaphor for the Jewish people. And God said that even though the Jews in the diaspora in exile are like a valley of dry bones, I will bring them together. I will bring the bones together and breathe new life in them. There was a Kabbalist in Israel known as the Chalban, and he brought down an idea that this represents two forms of Zionism. And this is my own interpretation of this. But the first is political Zionism, which I think is what Zahava just described, which is the bones come together. Right? That is the ingathering of the exiles. That is an army, a haven, a place for Jews to be together. And frankly, that's a dream that's already been fulfilled. It was, that was Herzl's dream. It was fulfilled in 48, reaffirmed in 67. And the first chapter of that prophecy, political Zionism, is actually a dream that has already been realized. And so what Zionism is for me is the second half of that prophecy. And I will breathe new life in them. And that's a real unification of the Jewish people and their Jewish values and a return to Jewish culture. The dream of political Zionism could have been fulfilled in Uganda. We could have had an army, a safe haven. The reason that we came back to the land of our forefathers is because Zionism is something more than just political autonomy and military representation, but it is a return to a unique Jewish culture, a Jewish way of life, and a unified Jewish spirit and a Jewish people. So in my opinion, that's what the Zionism is. The Zionist dream is now. But we have the politics more or less covered. But what does it mean to be a Jewish people in our own homeland?
So Benji, how would you describe, I guess, the culture that you've been talking about, this Jewish culture? So where do secular Jews or other
Am I the only one who lost her?
I think where she was, I think the question was asking, I don't want to speak for Nava, I don't know if we lost her, but I think the question was going to be a little bit about, like, how would you describe the Jewish culture and your vision of Zionism? Like, where do secular Jews and those who aren't necessarily religious fit into that?
Right. So that's obviously right, the Zionist question. And if the answer was easy, we wouldn't really be having this conversation, I guess. Obviously, halakha is a central part to Jewish culture. It's the bread and butter of our faith, and really the construct of Jewish life. I don't necessarily have a concrete vision for how each and every one of the 613 mitzvot is going to play out in Israeli society. That being said, right, I'm not, I think maybe a good litmus test is individual versus communal. It's beyond our control to mandate what every individual does, and freedom of expression and freedom of practice is obviously something that has to be maintained. At the same time, on a communal level, the more we could allow traditional Judaism to impact communal life, is not necessarily a bad thing. If it becomes too inhibiting for personal practice, okay, then that's something that needs to be be dealt with. And again, I guess the classic discussion is buses on Shabbos, right? So there's no simple answer there. But what we see that in more secular cities there is, and in more religious cities there isn't, and it's a work in progress. There's no simple answer, but I think that's a discussion that needs to be having, and on more than just simple halakhic questions, but on all cultural things. So I guess in short, I'm not really sure, Nava, but I would love to keep talking about it.
Okay, I'm gonna butt in here, and I'm gonna offer, I guess, this is more similar to the Hava's take, a little bit different from Benji's, but I'm personally of the opinion that Zionism today is just the promotion of a Jewish state. And by Jewish state, I mean a home for all Jews, because quite frankly, from the past, we've been a prosecuted people, and we need a safe haven for Jews at any time. And I want to make sure that it is to the exclusion of just for the sake of having a home for Jews, in the sense that there are certain other issues that might come up when talking about the state of Israel. There might be some other issues when it comes up to the state of what people, human beings, and I guess Jews in general around the globe. But I think those are all issues of policy opposed to an issue of Zionism. And I think that's something that's important. It's something that we have to, I guess, separate is exactly what are issues of policy and what are issues of Zionism. And to me, the only issue of Zionism is making sure that there is a state for all Jews to live in, and that is Israel. That's my personal opinion.
If I could jump in, I just wanted to add that I think it's interesting what Benji and Daniel say. I kind of see it more like Benji, that there was the original idea of what Zionism is, we're scattered among the nations, there's pogroms throughout history, we're not always so recognized and given many rights, kind of assumed to assimilate into the societies that we're living in. So I think it's very interesting. I mean, obviously, Herzl's idea of just a state where Jews could live among themselves and not be pressured into assimilating towards a certain idea of what society should be, where we could decide that for ourselves. That's why I think the future of Zionism is, if you want to say, us deciding what is Zionism now that we have this land, and that comes with, are we going to institute halacha as law, but that's a very tough question now because we have very different types of Jews living in Israel. It's very secular versus religious, Haredis, many types of Jews. So I think that's more what Zionism is to me today. How are we going to continue making, now that we have a Jewish land, how do we make it the most Jewish we could be and be a light onto the nations? And how are we gonna, put that into practice? Is that through halacha as the law of the land, or is it through another way? So that's just something we have to discuss with so many different types of people in the land. It's a discussion to be had.
I don't exactly disagree with anyone who's spoken before, but I personally feel like we're not there yet in terms of Zionism. I feel like when we're talking about today's Zionism, I think that the more immediate threat right now is surviving as a country and figuring out how to deal with other types of people and other religions. And I don't even think we're at that point where we can start just dealing with our religion. I think that that's hopefully will come up in the future. But I think for now, the sort of tension is coming from outside and not from our internal conflict.
I'd like to add also that I think there's a difference between a Jewish state and a state for the Jews. I think what Nava was saying, it's possible I'm wrong, so please correct me, that currently we have a state for the Jews, but perhaps we would prefer, or maybe going in the most ideal direction would be to create a Jewish state. And that I don't think we're up to right yet.
Can you clarify? Like, what do you mean that we're not up to that? Like, we need to be dealing with other stuff before we get to that, or is that not like something we want to do at all?
I think that perhaps it's an ideal, but I don't know that we are there yet, meaning what we have right now, the government that we have right now, I do not believe that that is the ideal. I think that we should be aiming for an ideal, perhaps for a Jewish state specifically, but I don't think that we have a full state following halacha properly the way that we would want it to be.
I have to agree with Zahava, and that's why I think with Sammy, and I think Sammy and I would both say that that's what Zionism is, right? That's the dream. But we do have a state for the Jews, right? And when we talk about a state for the Jews, right, using Daniel's definition of what Zionism is, right? A state for the Jews could have been anywhere. And yet the word Zionism, Tzionut, is based on the word Zion, on Zion. But and no, there's a difference between Zion, which is Jerusalem, right? A spiritual and cultural powerhouse, and just Israel or Judah, as in the physical land, right? Zionism is more than just borders. If it was just borders, right? And Daniel and Zahava too, I'd love to hear, based on your vision of what Zionism is, why couldn't the state of Israel have been in Uganda? Why couldn't it have been anywhere else? And why is it called Zionism? Why Zion? And what is and I guess if I could reframe the question, right? If that's what Zionism is to you, then what is Zion to you? Right? If Tzionut is about policy and politics, then what is Zion all about in the first place?
It's a good question. So first of all, we've always had a connection to Israel in general, the state of Israel, the land of Israel. We've always had a constant we've always had constantly people who've been living here for the past 3,000 years. So there has been that constant connection to it. And so Zion is referring to Jerusalem, it is referring to Israel. So that would be like my basic answer. The reason why I'm hesitant to say that, oh, we should be tying, I agree. Ideally, we should, I would love for Israel to be much more of a religious, for religious Zionism, to be a religious state. However, once we start tying in certain things tied to it, right? Then we want to be able to start creating, we're creating dependencies on the state. And once you make the state dependent on certain factors, you have an argument to make it illegitimate. And that's why I'm a little nervous to start saying, oh, now we have to have this vision of not only is it just a state for Jews, but now we have to make it religious, or now we have to make it, X or Y, whatever it is. And by doing so, now you're giving people reason to start saying, oh, maybe now it's not a legitimate mistake. We're not accomplishing those type of standards. So therefore, I want to hold Israel in the sense that I want to hold Israel as a country in the same way that every other country in the world is held. There's no question about. I understand you want to make it religious, but in terms of how I understand Zionism as just to create a country for Jews, okay, I think that should be held to the same standard as every other country. Okay, it's not tied to any other factors. It's just tied to the fact of it being a nationality, and that's to me what Zionism is. It's to have that connection to the nationality, nothing further. Then when you want to start talking about, either religious or ethical issues or whatever, those are issues of policy, right? If you want to make Israel into a religious state, into a devout religious state, to me that's an issue of policy. Okay, and therefore by doing so, you're separating the idea of making Israel a legitimate state versus making it an illegitimate state by making it dependent on certain factors, which I don't think it has to be.
I think the entire discussion you've just been having irons in the point that's raised in the question of this whole discussion, where what is Zionism for us today? In that creating a Jewish state, creating a homeland, whether it's for security reasons, whether it's to tie us back to Zion, for religious reasons, why it's particularly in Israel, that all has to do with, I think, as Benji made the distinction earlier, the Zionism that was until 1948 of we need a state to give us these goals. But once those goals have been established at 1948, the question still holds, which is the reason we're all here. What is Zionism for us today? And I think one point of Zionism today that I don't think has been discussed so much by us is what is Zionism for someone who doesn't plan to move to Israel, someone whose goal isn't to live in the state of Israel. Because one could argue Zionism today is a continued return to Zion for people living in the diaspora, trying to get back to Zion, which I think is a completely acceptable definition. But it does raise the question for all, I'm not claiming what anyone here's view is, but all of us are currently American citizens. And I would venture to say some people here do consider themselves Zionists. So another question is, what is the role of an American or of a non-Jew or of someone who doesn't live in Israel? And how are they able to be considered Zionists?
Right, but right. I understand that we need to discuss the American Jews and how they feel about Zionism and the Zionism in Israel. We also what is Zionism? Especially in Europe and in old Europe, all we wanted to do is just be there. And now that we're there, why is there not a reframing of it? Meaning, if we're there, what is Zionism to me today? I would say it's how our country interacts and how we can build upon our country. It doesn't we're there. Yes, but I agree with Benji said. Of course that we're going to Zion. Okay, and I do. But now that we're here, what are we supposed to do? Are we supposed to play nice with our neighbors? Are we supposed to, give every Israeli, including the Ethiopians, including anyone who comes into our borders? Should we give them assistance? There are many questions. What is Zionism to me? the culmination of different, struggles to create a better Israel. That's just what I think.
I'm happy that both Nina and Joe actually made a point that I think is very different than something Daniel said when he answered my last question. When I asked Daniel why Israel over Uganda, right, he pointed to the historical presence of the Jewish people in the land of Israel. If you notice, Nina and Joe both mentioned the yearning of all the people who weren't in the land of Israel. And I'm much more partial to their definition of historical Zionism. Because if our Zionism and our claim to the land of Israel is solely or even primarily based on the Jewish presence in the land, I mean, the Crusader period was brutal. The Jews were pretty much wiped out from the land of Israel. Same thing during same thing in the aftermath of the Roman captivity. But what Nina and Joe are picking up on is that Zionism is so much more about the cultural and spiritual wish and desire of diaspora Jewry over so long. And I think that basis of Zionism is what drives my argument and Sammy's argument. And Sammy, you could tell me if you agree or disagree. In that it's all about that desire, which was so much more than just a safe haven. Right? If you go through the liturgy of right, that talks about Zionism, right? Every time that Zion is mentioned during davening, and keep in mind that for the vast majority of Jewish history, right, the vast majority of Jews are religious and are talking about this. The Zionist dream is so much more than just political haven, and I feel like the point that I've been trying to make. And again, I'm interested to hear if Sammy agrees or disagrees with me on this, is about the Jewishness of the state. That's so much more than just halakha. That's so much more than just keeping Shabbos and kashrus, right? That affects all of policy. Meaning, how does our Jewishness, how does our Jewish identity affect our relationship with the Palestinians? How does it affect our opinion on global warming and the environment? How does it affect our opinion on social issues? And peace with other deals and our perspectives of other countries, right? So just to conclude with that idea, right? We had a seminar with Rav Yehuda Cohen from Vision, and he was talking about that our Jewish state would never sell weapons to genocidal dictatorships, and yet the state of Israel does. It has nothing to do with halakha, right? If you'd ask a secular person, should we be doing that? They wouldn't be thinking in terms of halakha, but they would definitely tell you it's contrary to Jewish values. Right, so that's a lot more than just buses on Shabbos. That's the conversation that we have to be having. That's what Zionism is. Right? And I'm very happy that I feel like a lot of people have been saying this already. We have a state, right? We have safe haven. We have a military. We have borders. And like if Zionism is about a state for Jews, I wonder what decade you think that you're living in. And I think we have time that we have a new conversation.
Can I clarify?
I think. Oh, sorry.
Okay. Can I clarify something you just said, Benji? According to your past comment, would you say that the definition of Zionism today is how do we incorporate Judaism and halacha and Jewish values into the running of the modern state of Israel?
I'd say that's one. I would say that's one facet of what Zionism is. And I'll clarify. Zionism is about bringing the Jewish people into a state that resembles the classic understanding of redemption. Right? Zionism is about creating a world that our ancestors, whether they were in Poland or in Spain or anywhere else where Jews were suffering, that they would identify as the fulfillment of their prayers and as the climax and conclusion of the story of Jewish history. Right? So we've checked one of those boxes, right? That's what we've been talking about so far, political Zionism, right? That's the first and foremost box, right? The place where Jews aren't deported to gas chambers, a place where Jewish soldiers, could protect the streets. But that was also only one aspect of our ancestors' dream. It's only one aspect of the ancient prophecies of which we hold dear, right? Halacha is another aspect.
So is hashkafa, right? How do we interact with these, dictatorships? We don't send them weapons, but also unification and love and toleration, right? Bringing all Jews together. As somebody mentioned, how do we view American Jews? How do we view people who live outside of Israel? Well, kibbutz hagaluyot, right? The ingathering of exiles, that is a very crucial part of the Zionist dream. So how are you a Zionist if you don't see yourself ending up in the land of Israel? You see your kids as ending up in the land of Israel, but other than that, I'm not really sure what your answer is. Right, so Nina, yes, halacha is an aspect, but I think it's a mistake to get bogged down in those technicalities. What's the secular person going to say about this? That's one little detail, and frankly, not the first thing that we have to address. But let's work on making sure that we're not violating the tenets of Jewish values when we support, regimes that are murdering innocent people, right? And then we can worry about buses on Shabbos. But yeah, we're gonna have to talk about buses on Shabbos at one point. That clearer? It's a very big idea. It's not. It can't be boiled down into a few kitschy catchphrases. And there are flaws, and it's difficult, and it's radical, but it's also true, and it's also a dream. And right, if we could all agree, right, that Zionism is about dreaming, it's about thinking big. Right? Political Zionism would have made no sense 150 years ago. It would have been just as crazy as the spiritual Zionism that I'm talking about now. Slowly, we're the Jewish people. We'll get there.
That's my question on your view, which I thank you so much for explaining it very thoroughly, and I appreciate that. And it was explained very well. I just am confused then, how would a non-Jew support the state of Israel? Why would a non-Jew want to live in the state of Israel? How are you able to factor those people into this equation of your dream of Zionism?
And also, also just to add to that, I mean, is Israel a Jewish state for the Jewish people only? Meaning there are other people that live there, there are other people that value and that see this as a holy site. This is like, the Jewish people are not the only people who like Israel. So where do they get put into the equation? Are they supposed to be part of that Jewish state, or is it going to be a state that is just, it's a Jewish state, and then there's all these other people that are also there who make up a tremendous amount of the population?
If I could add something, I just wanted to say, in response to that, I think you could kind of put it like hand in hand with the idea of us being a light onto the nations. Maybe us being like in a nation that it could be a Jewish nation with non-Jews in it, us living, like cohabiting together in peace and love and harmony. I think that's furthering what Zionism is and what we want to portray ourselves as the Jewish people, that, we work well with others, we have morality and fairness, and we want to work with other people, and we want to be a light onto the nation. We're not just fighting for ourselves and we want to be like isolationists, like we want our own place and no one else and everyone stay away from us. Like, that's not what we are. We want to, I think that getting a land for ourselves is not just for us. I think it allows us to do more for everyone. I think the world is better off when the Jewish people are united than when they're separated. And in response to something Benji and Daniel said earlier, Benji said something about, would we have achieved Zionism if we created a state in Uganda? And Daniel said, we want to be treated as like another nation, like just as like any other nation, just on this equal level. But I think inherent in Zionism is us getting back to the land of Israel, not a country in Uganda. We talk about it, we say in the Shona Esrei, the ingathering of the exiles, we talk about going back to Israel, not going back to the Jewish nation, wherever that may be. So I just think it's important, like, it's not just about us getting political freedom and a state of our own, it's getting it in the land of Israel, which has been promised to our forefathers, and anyone could read about it in the Torah. And I think that's what ultimately we need to be trying to get to, which we have.
All right, I would just like to add something here. First, I feel like we're kind of speaking on different planes here. Benji, you asked me what decade am I living in? And I kind of want to respond, what decade do you think you're living in? do you think that the world just sees Israel as a legitimate state? Do you think that there's no one out there who wants to contend on what's happening in Israel, and they're claiming that we have no right to the land? I mean, I don't know about you, but I read about it every day. People hate Jews just for the sake of being Jewish. And to say that, you're already playing. I feel like you're already playing on the idea that we have this state, and now from this state, where do we go from now? And I'm saying that, listen, I agree we do have a state, and when it comes to where we go from with that state now, I agree that we should be striving to having, you want to argue for religious, a more religious state. I'm for that. I'm all with that. However, at the same time, by doing so, I feel like we're still, we're not quite like at a place where we are at the same level with other countries, because other countries don't see us. A lot of people, I say other countries, but a lot of people around the world don't see us as a legitimate state. And to say, oh yeah, well, we could just disregard them because we have the state. Well, I'm saying I don't think that's so true, because who knows what might happen. We might get in a war. We might get in a war with one of our neighbor Arabs, and we will see where everyone lines up in that war. Who knows what could happen? And therefore, we have to start saying, to just say, oh, it doesn't, we have this state, and we could just start talking about what Zionism means on a religious level. Listen, I still think that we have to start saying, no, we have to make sure that our standard of what a country is at the same thing. This is going back to Sammy's point. Sammy, I'm not saying that we should view Israel as just another country. I'm saying that the way that we respond to people who criticize Israel for being unethical, for being an apartheid state, for being whatever, I think that those questions have to be totally separate from the idea of Israel being a legitimate country. Those questions have nothing to do with it. That's an issue of policy, and we can get into that. But when it comes to Israel being a legitimate state, we have to stay firm on that. We have to say, no, Israel is a legitimate state. Same way France is a legitimate state. Same way South Africa is a legitimate state. Because it has nothing to do, because policies is something else. We have to believe that we earned the right to have our own country, and we need it. And you want to ask why not Uganda? Because we do have this religious, I do agree with Benji, we do have this religious yearning to go back to Israel, and that's where we truly think we belong. That's where our state belongs. But now that we've chosen where it is, right, we have to defend the fact that we are a legitimate state. And to tie it into, to start talking about religious issues and start talking about, what it means and having and all these different policies, I think that's something we have to keep separate from the idea of making sure that we are considered a legitimate state. And that's what I mean by keeping the same standards as other countries. Because no other country is kept at those standards.
But you keep throwing something around and kind of just asking to clarify, what is a legitimate state? Like you threw in South Africa and France. Like, is it that states have their values in order? Like you're saying also values are like a secondary question to becoming a legitimate state. So what is it that creates a legitimate, like the UN vote, like other people acknowledging it? Like what is a legitimate state?
So I want to answer Daniel's point, which I think will obviously center around Akiva's point. First, I do want to respond to Nina's question about how other how non-Jews should view Israel. Quickly before that, I said the Valley of Dry Bones was in Jeremiah 37. It's in Ezekiel 37. That's my bad. Okay. Now, I'm sorry. Okay, so on the point of non-Jews, I think Sammy really got the gist of what I believe as well. I just want to add one more point. It's that we don't believe, if you go through the latter prophets, right, Jeremiah or Ezekiel, but in this case, Zechariah, you'll see that the vision of what redemption looks like is not a state only for the Jewish people. At the end of Zechariah, it says that the nations will come and they will say, let us ascend to the house of the God of Jacob, right? For Torah comes forth from Zion, right? Ki mitzion tetzeh Torah. Right? Zionism is all about that vision, as well as a place where Jews could live according to our values, but a place where all people come, right, to celebrate the communal value. And we already see that beginning to happen. And one of the pictures I have on the wall right there is Rav Eliezer Melamed, He's a religious Zionist rabbi, and he runs a strictly Orthodox community, and and evangelical Christians are starting to move in. Right? It's a place for people. It's a place for all people to come together. I think I don't quote me on this, but I'm pretty sure Rabbi Victor Neventhal of the Old City says that in the end of days, when the Beis Hamikdash returns atop the Temple Mount, the Al-Aqsa Mosque is not going anywhere. It will also be there, because Mount Zion and Mount Moriah is a place for all nations to come together as worship. Right? And it'll be to worship the one true God, right? The God of all of us. But we see non-Jews as part of the fabric of our society, and I think it would be be a folly to think that our vision is so close-minded. To respond to Daniel's point, right, and Akiva's larger question on what is a legitimate state, I want to take Daniel's point and flip it on its head. If you were to ask a French person what is French nationalism, you're not going to find a single French person saying it is the constant defense of the French people's right to live in their land. Right? And if you ask the vast majority of nationalists in any country, they're not going to tell you that. Right? Instead, they're going to tell you it's about making life better for the French people, a commitment to French values and French history, fulfilling the legacy of historical France, etc., etc. The Jewish people have encountered more backlash, right, for their nationalist political vision. At the same time, that's predictable. We saw that coming. I mean, anti-Semitism is part of the fabric of the diaspora. The Messiah hasn't come. We're still living in diaspora. All of us, I believe, are in the United States of America. That's part of the exile, right? And Esav Sonat Yaakov, right? Rome hates Jerusalem. That's a classic trope. That's a classic trope of our belief system. So Daniel, I wouldn't get so bogged down on that. I wouldn't get so caught up in that. Yeah. So I think it's a betrayal of our values if we allow ourselves to think that our entire conversation should be centered around the anti-Semitism instead of looking beyond that. Address the anti-Semitism, but don't define our nationalist and religious ideals as solely based on that.
So Benjamin, I actually think that the fact that I like how you said, if you ask a French person, they're not going to say, they have to constantly defend whatever. I don't remember exactly the words you used, but that they're not going to say that they constantly are, defending their right to the French nationality. And I think that actually you saying that sort of shows us that I think that I agree that eventually, the points that you're making about how we have to actively make the Jewish state a better place for Jews and for, the world at large. But I think it's a little bit premature. I think that I agree with Daniel in that, like, what not in an aggressive way, but what century do you feel like you're living in? I think that at this point in time, another thing that you mentioned earlier was that we have the safety and the borders. And I think that that's not necessarily true. I think that, when we go to Israel, we feel the safety, and that's an amazing thing. But I don't think that we can take that for granted. I don't think that that's a given. And I think that the borders are constantly being attacked, renegotiated, debated over. And for those reasons, I do think that, the morality of the land is a little bit premature. I think it's definitely a dream to have long term. But I think that the reason that any Israeli feels that they would have to say that they have to defend their nationality is because that's the reality we're living in. Our nationality is being attacked on a constant basis, even while we do have, the rights and the safety to walk around the land. I don't think that that's a given. And I think that we forget that sometimes when we're in relative peace.
So I think this is actually a great segue to the next question, which is more focused on, does Israeli policy play into our Zionism, specifically focusing on Judea and Samaria, the right to return, the fact that if a terrorist commits an act in Israel, Israel will then destroy the terrorist's house. So are there certain values or goals that Israel's government should ideally embody? And we're going to start this question off with Joe.
Thank you, Deborah. I think that yeah, there is a that there. Sorry, repeat the question. It was there's certain values, right? That Israel needs to possess. I believe that that would be included within Zionism. Ever since the creation of the state, we were trying to get to the land of Israel, and to also be able to do the right thing and go about creating a society that really just is great. I mean, the kibbutzniks, tried it, it ended up failing, communism in general. But they were trying. They're also like Rodei Shalom. They were really trying to look for that peace. And we were really trying to develop ourselves and the nation into like a budding city. I forget, is it John Rolfe? Someone once said there's a city upon a hill, that's what America should be. And, maybe that's what we want to be. What is intrinsic a part of Zionism is also not only, having the land, just being there, but really taking it up from the, from like what it was, desolate. Mark Twain specifically said it in one of his books, that it was just a desolate land. And then what we're supposed to do is we're supposed to bring it up and bring it to some sort of holy position. So a part of that holy position is really just, having, human rights and doing the right things. You got to do the right thing. And that's what Zionism is all about. First, being on the land, and second, developing the land into something amazing.
I think preceding all these policy decisions is really is something we need to figure out, is our value judgments and how we hold on all these basic like rights or policies. And like if you look at, like, to bring it back to France, if you look at the Rabbi Sachs, to Chrono Levracha, like he wrote about, if you look at the French Revolution and their poor value judgments and how it failed so easily. But if you look at the American Revolution and how that created what America is today based on its values. And so I think, like, really to be successful and to really come to a policy decision is to really figure out the value judgments on how halacha and basic Jewish values aligns into all these policies.
I think
that if you...
Oh, sorry, Zahava.
Okay, you after Nava. Yeah, thank you. I think that if you would ask anybody what type of ideals and values should their own government have, the answer will be my values. I mean, everything that I think, that's exactly what the government should do. That's like the automatic, because I don't want my government to do something I disagree with. So my automatic feeling is, of course, they should follow halacha, but they should follow halacha in the way that I see it, in the way that in the modern Orthodox, like the whole yeshiva university mentality, but that's also not possible, because that's not, every single Jewish person has a very different take on what their Jewishness means, so what their values and what their goals are, and what the Israeli government should look like. There is never going to be a consensus. So I think that while it does play an important role in Zionism, the current policies of the government, whoever's in charge or whoever's not in charge of the current Israeli government, ultimately, I don't think it should impact your decision on your Zionism, because if your Zionism is just solely dependent on the fact if the Israeli government is doing what you think they should be doing or not, then your Zionism is not, there's no basis for it.
And I think I was going to go on a slightly different point, but sort of a little bit similar to Zahava. This question is definitely something that I've struggled with a lot. Rabbi Beryl Wein has said that, a lot of people expect Israel to be a moral state and, challenge your belief. Is that really true? Does Israel have a responsibility to be a moral state? It definitely wasn't founded with those intentions in mind. It was founded as a secular state. And I think that what we're feeling now is, as time goes on, and we feel like, we've used the secularism to accomplish what we need, can we start bringing religion into it? And I think that can be extremely complicated in terms of morality of, let's say, demolishing houses or settling the West Bank. Any of those issues really come down to the fact that we are not going to agree. And does Israel have the responsibility to act morally? Like on a personal level, I feel like, of course, I would love them to act morally, but realistically, is that really the case? Can we expect Israel to do that much? I mean, it's already so divided. I don't know if that's at this point in time. I'm not sure if that's a possibility. And to ask that much of Israel is to then have to decide, whose morals. I mean, then there's always, of course, a lot of times, not to bring something extremely controversial into this already pretty controversial debate, but when it comes down to a lot of points were mentioned about including everybody and really bringing everyone together, and there is, let's say, the LGBTQ plus community in Tel Aviv and Israel, that's really caused a lot of tension. And when you say that you want Israel to uphold morality, where do you draw the line in that? I mean, I think everyone can agree that they shouldn't sell weaponry to, terrorists, but where do you draw the line there?
I can answer that. I just wanted to say, for the dreamers like me and Benji, I don't want to speak for him, but I would say we hold them up to like the highest form of morality. Like if we want to be a light onto the people, we have to set the proper example. And that comes with the questions over Judea and Samaria. Like we have to approach things from a different perspective. We hold ourselves to different standards than other people's do. So, we have to be able to go about things and, really get the land of Israel in the proper way. We can't take shortcuts. We can't do things that other people are doing. Like obviously we can't sell weapons, like it's we have to hold ourselves to the highest form of morality, because how else are we going to be, we would just be hypocrites at that point if we're saying, we're the light onto the people and we're look towards us and we're not upholding what we believe.
But something that I would also like to address, I think, is just that where then, again, bringing up something very controversial, but in terms of the Palestinian conflict, many people would say that what Israel is doing is not moral. And many people are saying, oh, no, it is moral because, they struck us first, or Hamas is in control. There are a lot of different ways that you can view it, but at the end of the day, what can you call morality? I think that the Torah gives us a very objective view of what morality is. But in terms of how it plays out in these specific cases and with the rest of the world, like how would you dreamers, how would you address that?
We have to, hold the magnifying glass to everything going on there, like on both sides, how we react to things they do and how they react to things we do. We need to, really make sure that the narrative being spread to people in other countries and around the world, how people view us, the UN, how they view the situation is, how things are. Make sure that the facts are being given, like make sure that people are being held to their side of the deal. You can't just resort to violence when we don't get our way. We also can't resort to occupations when we don't get our way. It's not one size. Now we don't get some exceptions that they don't. We all have to do our part here.
Right, but can you also blame the Palestinian people for what their leaders do? Meaning if the Palestinian leaders are like, hey, let's fire rockets, let's shoot some Israelis on the other side of the border. What like are we turning off their water or not giving them waste disposal or shutting off their fishing rights to about like 1 mile off the coast? Like it's just sometimes it just. Just now I'm just saying it gets ridiculous sometimes.
You're right, though. We have to hold a magnifying glass to both sides. They shouldn't be firing rockets, and we shouldn't be shutting off water, in my opinion.
Right, but it's not the Palestinian people. It's the leadership, and we should not. And I would say that we should uphold like show restraint towards the people, because they didn't really do much, and it's the leadership that is curving them the wrong direction.
Of course, so hold the magnifying glass up to the leadership, saying this is their leadership and this is how they're choosing to approach the situation. But we also have to be held accountable for, turning off water to an innocent people. It's both sides. We all have to be held to the same standard, or else it's just not going to work.
Just as a response to that, I wish that could be the world that we live in, that if we realize, hey, we're doing something wrong, that we just stop. But unfortunately, that's not the reality. I wish that we could be talking of what people should and shouldn't do, but really what we need to be talking about is what people are and are not doing. So yes, there shouldn't be an occupation, but there is an occupation, however you define that word, or there is immoral acts on both sides going on. So perhaps the question is the Israeli government what role does halacha play in when the Israeli government is supposed to be making these decisions?
I would say that halacha is very, very, with halacha is very tricky to apply some aspects of halacha. For example, the whole issue of the Palestinian conflict, where do you find that in the Torah? Where is that written? It's not like something that's so simple, right? That's why I like to resort back to the whole idea of separating Zionism and policy and making this more into an issue of policy. Because once you enter the issue of, oh, is this like an issue of Zionism, then you have a lot of people on the other side saying, oh, what Israel's doing right now is immoral, and therefore what gives them the right to do this? What gives them the right to have a country? And therefore to say, oh, we're just going to be a religious Zionist country, and we're just going to be a new we're striving for what the Torah says. The Torah is not always so clear what they want in the situation. It's conflicted. It's not so issue. It's not such an easy answer. So at the end of the day, these are just issues of policy. And when it comes to molding our idea of what exactly that, how it fits into Zionism, I don't personally think it should. I don't think as if it's contemporary Zionism, I don't think it has anything to do with it. I think this is just an issue of policy, and this is something that comes after the fact of we having our own country. Now, going back to the issue, though, of what exactly our laws should be, I'm kind of with Sammy and presumably probably Benji here, that listen, we are believe that Judaism is the moral law. We believe that is where we get our morality, and it's just an issue of closer inspection as to what exactly it is. But to quote Rabbi Sachs, or Lord Jonathan Sachs, Judaism takes the world from what it is and to what it ought to be. That is how we are going to get what's they call. That's how we're going to be an Or Lagoyim, right? This is how we're going to do it. So therefore, in order to do that, we have to maintain our preservedness, our persistency to the Torah, and we have to be able to determine based on what the Torah says what to do. Again, that's not something that's so easy in most times, which is why it's hard to actually therefore associate it to Zionism itself, because it's not so clear, and just because it's a lot of it's held to debate.
I mean, not this, just to address that small detail of that point. No one's asking Benjamin Netanyahu and the members of Knesset to open up a Rambam and a Sefer Devarim and try to figure out what the Jewish approach to war is. But we do have Torah leadership. I mean, there is a thriving religious Zionist community which has churned out remarkable leaders who are well versed in both Torah law and politics. And as surprising as it may seem to us, they have put out their own opinions on what the Torah law is towards combat, towards policy, towards peace, and that's a very good place to start. I think it would be a mistake to write off consulting the Torah and halacha because it's too confusing or obscure. That's why we have a Masorah. That's why we have Rebbeim. And it becomes a little bit clearer once we take that step.
All right.
Sorry. So we're just going to move on to the next and last question we'll be using in this forum. This is more looking towards the future and seeing what the future goals of Zionism are. So what should we be doing now to fulfill the goals we have of Zionism and our aspirations of what Zionism should look like? What should that be in the state of Israel? And we're going to start off with Nina.
I think having a question based on what can we do now to fulfill the goals of Zionism is complex in that I don't think any one of us here has we definitely don't have one perspective on what would be Zionism. So I think all of us, our subsequent goals and steps to achieve that goal would then be different. I think according to the view of Zionism that it's the return, all of us should be buying a ticket and buying a plot of land in Israel. But whether a goal is to have a more halachic and moral state in Israel, that could be like calling out members of Knesset, lawmakers in Israel, trying to work to enact policy that would be more in line with what someone views as their ideal goal for the state of Israel. Or I think those would probably be the two primary ways to move forward.
I feel like I'm kind of beating a dead horse here because I kind of just like repeating the same point. But I feel like we kind of have, to a certain degree, accomplished Zionism in the sense that we have our Jewish state. And I kind of feel like just in order to continue it, we just got to keep promoting the Jewish state and keep defending the Jewish state from antagonists. And and that's how we do it, right? And that is what needs to be done. Now, when it comes to, I know people are going to be like, oh, we have to strive for more idealism. We have to strive for more, ethicalness and religious, thirst. And I agree. Those are things of policy, though. I just want to emphasize that's an issue of policy. That is not necessarily something that has to be tied in to Zionism.
Daniel, I'm happy to tell you that the horse is very much alive. And I think the question is about policy. And frankly, I think even if whether you believe policy is tied into Zionism, like Sammy and I, and the rest of the Dreamer Coalition, or if you don't, I mean, I think this question is about policy because at the end of the day, policy promotes Zionism. Right? Your vision of Zionism is being promoted by Israeli policy. That's the Hasbara movement. And I guess, and so I'm not sure how you could remove the conversation from policy. Policy is everything to this question. To answer the question from my own perspective, I think it's taking Israel in a new direction. I think it's looking back at the last 70 years, seeing what we did right, seeing what we did wrong, and starting to think about where we're going now. Here's an idea. What does political autonomy mean on a global scale? It seems that America has been trying to write an Israeli foreign policy since 48. What do we have to say about that? Right, and it seems that so much of our military is dependent on American aid. How do we feel about that? What does that say about Israel's future? Daniel, you see Israel's future as a continuation of the present. To be perfectly honest, I'm not so happy with the present. So I think we have to be asking bigger questions than just continue to recycle the same AIPAC talking points. Not that there's anything wrong with AIPAC, but
just to
I think
respond.
that there's a reason. Sorry.
Just quick response. Sorry, just quick response. Policy does direct where Israel stands. However, I don't necessarily think that. Therefore, that's where again I feel like you're automatically conflating policy and Zionism, and you're saying that Zionism is therefore is influenced by policy. And I'm saying it doesn't have to be. And I'm saying you could still take Israel to another level based on policy, and it has nothing to do with Zionism. That's totally irrelevant. And therefore, I agree. Israel should could change peace. But whether your whole thing about America or whatever, that's a separate debate I don't want to get into right now because I want to let Nav answer. But I personally believe that policy has nothing to shifting Israel's focal points and viewpoints on certain issues could be done through policy and has nothing to do with Zionism.
Well, now I feel like I should respond to Neil's point, but I think that, like Nina said, the reason, just to answer the original question, I think that, like Nina said, it's incredibly complicated because we all have such a different view of Zionism. But I disagree with Benji in that I do think the reason that AIPAC talking points
Zoom censoring Nava, but I still want to Nava pick up your Wi-Fi.
APAC censored Nava.
So I want to pick up.
Do you want to continue because you were about to speak?
Me?
Yeah.
I have a question for Daniel. If you don't think that the next step forward should be focusing on policy, what do you think the next step forward for modern Zionism is today?
Yeah, I just want to clarify. Next step forward could be policy. It is policy. I'm just saying that you don't put policy next to Zionism. As in, policy and Zionism are two separate things. Zionism, to me, is just the promotion of having an Israeli state. It's very simple. That's the only thing to it. Okay? Defending the idea of having a Jewish state for Jews to live in, for all Jews to live in, and it should be a light to other nations. It should be an accepting place for all nations. However, that has nothing necessarily to do with policy. Then when we get into policy, right, that whether it's the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, whether it's LGBTQ in Israel, whether it's selling how our relationship with America or with China or with any other global power, right? That's issues of policy, and those are issues that Israel could then now shift its focus on, and those are things that we could talk about. But that doesn't necessarily have anything to do with the definition of Zionism. So if you want to be Zionistic, let's say, and you want to say, oh, I want to promote Judaism, I want to promote the Israeli state, I want to promote living or having people defending the Jewish state, right? That is one point. And then you want to say, yeah, and then I believe that we should have a two-state solution, or as Benji wants to do, is try to, leave America and not be so dependent on America, right? That's a separate issue. That has nothing to do with Zionism. That is an issue of policy. So the two things I want to keep separate, and primarily the reason I want to keep separate is because once we start conflating the two and start saying policy is that Zionism is dependent on policy, then what happens once, let's say, you don't accomplish the policies that you strive for, that you think are ideal? What happens when you say, yeah, I believe Israel should be an ethical place, and let's say it isn't an ethical place, or shouldn't be dependent on another country when you say it should be dependent on another country, right? Are you therefore saying that Israel should not be a country? It doesn't have the right to be a country? These are things that people are saying, and these are issues I think that we have to kind of like answer, and we have to say, no, you have to put Israel at the same standard that we put every other country. If for example, when South Africa was having an apartheid state back in like the 80s and the early 90s or whatever, what's it called? No one was questioning South Africa's legitimacy to be its own country. People were questioning its policies, right? It wasn't something that people were questioning, oh, does South Africa now have a legitimate right to be a country? Should they be torn off the map? Should they be allowed to go to the UN? Should they, that wasn't a question people were asking, right? People were just saying, what are they doing? That's not right. That's policy. That is nothing to do with the right to exist as a state. And that's what I want to separate. And I don't think that Israel should be held under a different light than any other country. That's my 2 cents.
First I want to ask, isn't Zionism itself a policy? So, like, first off, or maybe you could say it's more of a meta policy, but also, why does the questioning of someone's policy create illegitimacy? If you look at America, and it's founded upon like basic rights of like freedom of speech, religion, etc. If you look at like the issues with the ERA and civil rights and all the things that American history has dealt with, no one questioned that evolving policy creates illegitimacy. No, it creates keeping up with modern times and correcting yourselves and evolving and becoming better. Just because policy isn't necessarily met, I don't think creates illegitimacy.
Yeah, if I could just also ask a similar question before you respond, Daniel. So really, what you truly want is for us to rename this conversation what should be Israeli policy, and just not call it Zionism, and take the collected writings of Rav Kook and say this is not Zionist literature, it's just Jewish literature, and just say, Zionism is no, and I guess here's my question: so Zionism to you is not really that important anymore? Meaning the majority of the Zionist stream has already been fulfilled. All the Zionism is should just be the few watchdog agencies there, just making sure that everything's okay. And when we talk about policy, we just shouldn't call it Zionism. We shouldn't identify any of the policy with the phrase Zionism. That's my understanding, right? And tell me if that's a correct understanding of what you're saying. And B, I want to reiterate the danger of that, because then we all identify Zionism with the 2,000-year dream of returning to our homeland. If we remove Israeli policy from the phrase Zionism, then we remove everything that our state does from our ancestral, moral, ethical, communal, and spiritual vision that has kept our people alive throughout the past 2 millennia. It's not just a question in semantics. Your separation of policy and existence based on the concerns that other nations are going to say mean things about us in the United Nations, the also powerful, powerless group, that essentially undermines the connection between policy and our vision that is so central and fundamental to our national existence and heritage. So I think I understand what you're trying to say, and correct me if I'm wrong. And I hope I've expressed why that understanding scares me so much.
All right, so I don't understand. I don't really understand why you can't have a country based on fundamental policies. If you want to link Israel's policies to our Zionistic dreams from 2,000 years of history of people wanting to go back in our moral and ethical guidelines and our code, why can't that be based fundamentally in our policy making? Why is that based in how we define Zionism? Okay, when it comes to Zionism, all I'm trying to say is that it is something that we have to be. All I'm trying to say, just real quick, because I want to let other people answer, but it's just something separate, because we have to be very cautious as to what other people think, and we have to be very cautious as to making sure that we are considered to be I just want Israel to be scrutinized the same way every other country is scrutinized. I don't want it to fall into other issues.
It's a reality. Israel is going to be scrutinized. They are going to be put on a pedestal in order to make fun of and to point fingers at. So I feel like at this point, it's just like expected. We should really just like ignore it, pretend that it's not happening, because Israel should just do what Israel thinks is right to do. I think that also combining the Zionism in terms of policy, like I said before, and I'm going to say it again, Zionism cannot be dependent on a policy, because if the policy is wrong, if the policy is not halakhically moral, halakhically proper, then there goes your Zionism. There's no basis. At the same time, I don't think that we're there yet in terms of saying that what we have as a Israeli government is the ultimate goal of Zionism, because the ultimate goal of Zionism, what is it? That yearning that's been talking about, the dreamers that we've been talking about, that's all about talking about the Messiah coming. And what does that mean? It means to have a Jewish sovereignty in the land. And I don't think that we have that. I don't even know how to describe the Israeli politics system. I don't think anybody does, including the people who are in it, but they know that it's a mess. It's not democratic. There's tremendous amounts of politics. There's a tremendous amount of things that should not be going on, and halakhically are definitely problematic. But at the same time, if you're going to say that my Zionism is dependent on these people, then your Zionism is not worth anything, because every time there's a new election, your Zionism's definition is going to change. I think that we need to continue to strive for the ideal, and we need to continue to work on ourselves, and really not, when I say ourselves, I mean work on Israel and what Israel stands for. And really, I think the most important thing is to not give up, because we can have a conversation. We can keep on going for another 4 hours. this conversation can go on, and people have gone on for hours and years, centuries. This discussion is not going to end in 5 minutes, but at the same time, if we end it by saying, like, you know what, like, it's not worth it, it's not going to happen, then that's it. So I think that even though we're not going to come to a conclusion, even though what we have right now is not what we want it to be or what it should be, I think the continued striving towards getting to that point is definitely worth it.
And you're
And
making
this-
the distinction that that nationalism isn't the same thing as being Zioni.
Yes, I think.
Okay.
Just another quick point I wanted to add, though, back to, I guess, like Benji and Sammy's view of everything. Clearly, this has been causing a lot of controversy, but I think part of the problem with having policies defined by our Zionism, whatever that is that the founding of the state of Israel was founded on a secular view of Zionism, of, you know, that Jews wanted a place, regardless of what type of Jew they were, regardless of how the land was governed. And at this point, to suddenly, you know, pull a switcheroo on everyone who's living there and every other person who values the state of Israel, to suddenly say that, oh, the state of Israel needs to be a halachically or even just a moral state. You know, if we had been founded on that basis, I think that would have been amazing. That would have been the ideal. But the reality is we weren't founded like that. So, you know, to say that suddenly we should switch to that now, I think is ignoring what to do with millions of people who are secular, Christian, you know, Druze, Palestinian. They don't identify with that halachic or moral sort of thing. And I think it's, I don't know, it's a little, for me, it's kind of a leap at this point to say that that's what we should be striving towards, because that's neglecting, I don't have like numbers off the top of my head, but that's neglecting at least 3/4 of the country, probably more. And we can't just pull the rug out from under people suddenly and just switch that, because that's not what Israel was founded on.
If I can answer that, maybe speak for Benji as well. I don't think what me and him were trying to say was necessarily institute halacha as the law of the land for everyone. I think in relation to the question, the last question about the future of Israel, and maybe if you want to say it's Zionism, whether you're Daniel or not, would be, we do have to talk about that, about how we have to, you know, talk about how there's a lot of different types of Jews in Israel. And that's why I think it's good we have a parliamentary system where there's a lot more representation than maybe in a presidential one, you know, where it's not population, it's just electoral college. But, you know, like, I think it opened up the door for us to really get more voices to be heard. And I think that's the future of Zionism, for us to be more open to hearing other people's opinions instead of yelling across the room ours. You know, there are a lot of different people with different opinions, and we need to recognize all those opinions and work together to find a solution. And I think that goes with what we were talking about earlier about, you know, non-Jews living in the land. I think how we be a light onto the people is showing that we could work with others and we could all find a way to live together in a democratic state, you know, where every voice is heard. And I don't think that necessarily means that we need to institute, you know, halacha for everyone. I think that's what Benji was saying. Is it a communal thing, or do we want to keep individualistic? And that's a question to be had. And I think that's the future of what we need to be doing to progress Zionism.
Wow, that was incredible, really. Like, I'm just amazed that this was such a thought-provoking, provocative discussion. It was really just truly incredible. I wanted to thank all of you, all of our participants, for all your interesting questions, your ideas, your concerns for the state of Israel and what Zionism should look like. And I really can't wait to see where it takes you. And I also wanted to thank all the attendees here for coming and showing your support. I know I'm definitely walking away with having learned many new perspectives and going to have to think about my own. I hope everyone has a wonderful night, and we can't wait to see you at the next Jewish Forum for Dialogue Forum. Have a wonderful night, everyone.